Emily Warren slid quietly into seat 21C, the soft fabric brushing against her arm as she settled in. To the casual observer, she was unremarkable, just another traveler blending into the shuffle of boarding passengers. Her auburn hair was pulled into a neat bun, her clothing plain but tidy, her demeanor calm, almost distant. She carried no chatter, no complaints, no visible anxiety. In a cabin filled with the noise of families, business people, and restless tourists, Emily faded into the background. That was exactly how she preferred it. The Boeing 777 was nearly full, its aisles buzzing with the small dramas of travel. A mother wrestled a stroller into the overhead compartment, while her toddler wailed with the determination only a child could muster. A businessman in a tailored suit argued quietly with his assistant over the phone, already irritated before takeoff. A group of students snapped selfies, their laughter piercing through the hum of the engines as boarding continued. Flight attendants moved briskly between rows, their practiced smiles balancing efficiency with warmth. In the back of the aircraft, a man stood out not because of anything he did, but because of who he was. Broad-shouldered, tall, with a calm intensity, Captain Mason occupied his aisle seat with quiet authority. He wore plain clothes, but his bearing betrayed him. Years of training, discipline, and combat etched into every movement. To the other passengers, he was just another traveler. But to anyone who looked closely, he radiated the presence of someone who had led men through war zones. Mason was returning from deployment, carrying stories he would never tell, wearing invisible scars the world would never see. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as boarding finished. Emily glanced out the oval window beside her. The runway stretched endlessly into the night, dotted with blinking lights that shimmered like distant stars. She pressed her lips together, a habit she had carried since childhood when nerves threatened to show. Though she appeared composed, something deeper stirred inside her, a quiet tension she never fully shed when flying. Not fear, not discomfort. Something else. A memory she buried long ago. The engines roared to life, a deep thunder rolling beneath her feet. As the plane taxied toward takeoff, the passengers around her settled in. Some closed their eyes, exhausted before the journey even began. Others flipped through in-flight magazines, their glossy pages reflecting the dim light. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel, recycled air, and the anticipation of long hours ahead. Emily closed her eyes briefly as the plane surged forward, pressed back into her seat by the force of acceleration. The vibration of the wheels on the tarmac grew louder, faster, until suddenly it softened, replaced by the smooth, suspended sensation of flight. The city lights below blurred into a glittering web, shrinking as they climbed higher into the darkness. She exhaled slowly, opening her eyes. The Atlantic stretched below, an endless void hidden by the night. The hum of engines filled the cabin, steady, powerful, almost comforting. For most passengers, this was the beginning of a long, uneventful journey. For Emily, it was supposed to be the same. She had booked the flight for practical reasons, nothing more. A family visit in London, a reunion she had put off too many times. Nothing extraordinary, nothing to mark the journey as memorable. But life had other plans. Across the aisle, a teenage boy fiddled nervously with his seatbelt, tapping it against the armrest. Emily offered him a small, reassuring smile. He returned it shyly before burying his face in a video game console. To her left, a middle-aged couple whispered about connecting flights and missed hotel reservations. Their words blurred into the drone of the engines. Hours stretched ahead. The cabin gradually settled into its rhythm, the occasional clink of drink carts, the hushed voices of flight attendants, the shifting of passengers seeking comfort. Darkness pressed against the windows, broken only by the distant pinpricks of stars above. Emily leaned back, folding her arms lightly. She thought about how ordinary it all felt. 100 strangers, each carrying private stories, bundled together in a steel tube hurtling across the ocean. Most would never learn each other's names. By tomorrow, they would scatter, returning to their separate lives. That was the strange intimacy of air travel, briefly sharing space, breath, and time with people who would otherwise remain ghosts. In seat 21C, Emily remained invisible. She liked it that way. Attention was a weight she no longer craved. Once, long ago, she had stood in a cockpit wearing a uniform, her name stitched in neat letters across her chest. Once, she had spoken confidently over radios, given commands, and held the trust of crews who looked to her for leadership. But those days had ended abruptly, violently, leaving scars that didn't show on her skin. Now, she kept her past sealed tightly, buried beneath a quiet smile and unassuming manners. To anyone glancing her way, she was just another traveler. Nothing more, nothing less. But fate has a way of ignoring disguises. As the flight attendants dimmed the cabin lights further, signaling the long night ahead, Emily closed her eyes and rested her head against the seat. Around her, the aircraft seemed to exhale a collective sigh of passengers settling in. Families tucked children under blankets. A man near the front ordered his second glass of whiskey. Captain Mason stretched his legs, scanning the cabin with the instinctive vigilance of a soldier who never truly rested. Above the soft hum, the intercom clicked on. A cheerful flight attendant's voice wished everyone a pleasant journey. The words floated harmlessly into the air, routine and practiced. No one gave them much thought. Not yet. Because for Emily Warren, seated quietly in 21C, this flight would be anything but ordinary. By the time the sun rose over Europe, the strangers around her would no longer be strangers. They would know her name. They would owe her their lives. For now, she was invisible. For now, she was just a woman with her thoughts, staring out into the dark sky. But soon, very soon, the world would see what she had tried so hard to hide. At first, the night seemed calm. The plane soared steadily, its engines humming a deep and reassuring rhythm. Dinner trays had been cleared, the cabin lights dimmed, and most passengers were either asleep or lost in quiet distractions. The Atlantic stretched endlessly beneath them, black, featureless, indifferent. Hours still remained before dawn touched the English coast, yet nothing suggested that this flight would be remembered for anything but its length. Then turbulence struck. It began with a shudder, a sudden dip that jolted drinks from cup holders and sent a ripple of gasps through the cabin. Emily's head snapped up from the haze of her drifting thoughts, her seatbelt tugging against her waist. A half-empty cup of ginger ale toppled from the tray of the man across the aisle, splashing against the carpet. For most, turbulence was an annoyance, nothing more. They had felt it before. The flight attendants had warned of light chop before takeoff. But this felt different, sharper, more violent, a rolling shake that lingered long after it should have passed. A child cried out near the rear of the plane, her voice carrying above the uneasy laughter of adults, trying to pretend it was normal. The overhead bins rattled, a few popping slightly open before attendants rushed to secure them. Emily gripped the armrest. Her instincts, sharpened from years spent in cockpits, recognized the difference. This wasn't routine turbulence. Something else was wrong. The intercom crackled. Passengers stilled, waiting. "Ladies and gentlemen." The voice was not the smooth, practiced tone they had heard during takeoff. It was strained, shaky, heavy with effort. "This is your captain speaking. We are experiencing a medical situation in the cockpit." A hush fell over the cabin. Words hung in the recycled air, confusing, incomplete. Emily's pulse quickened. She had heard pilots speak under stress before. This was not turbulence. This was not routine. Something had gone terribly wrong. We ask that you remain calm. Our crew is doing everything possible. The transmission cut abruptly, replaced by static. Passengers exchanged looks, wide-eyed, nervous. A murmur spread through the cabin, a ripple of fear disguised as speculation. What did he mean? Medical? Is the pilot okay? Then, movement. Two flight attendants rushed down the aisle, their normally composed faces tight with urgency. One carried a medical kit, the Red Cross unmistakable against the white case. They hurried toward the cockpit, disappearing behind the reinforced door. The quiet hum of the engines seemed louder now, filling the silence left by unanswered questions. Minutes stretched like hours. The cabin waited, each second pulling nerves tighter. Emily glanced sideways. Mason, the Navy SEAL captain, sat rigid, his jaw clenched. He wasn't panicking. Men like him rarely did, but his eyes scanned the room, sharp, calculating. Soldiers could sense danger before it fully arrived. He had felt it in war zones, and now, sitting in the narrow seat of a commercial airliner, he felt it again. The intercom returned. This time, a flight attendant's voice, not the captain's. She sounded young, her professional tone cracking at the edges. Ladies and gentlemen, if there is a doctor on board, please make yourself known immediately. We have a medical emergency. Gasps erupted. Several passengers stood, identifying themselves. A pair of doctors hurried forward, escorted past the curtain toward the cockpit. Panic swelled like a rising tide. What emergency could be so dire required passengers to assist? Emily's stomach dropped as the pieces began falling into place. She closed her eyes briefly, willing herself not to imagine. But the truth gnawed at her. Pilots were trained to handle almost any emergency. If the crew had turned to the cabin, it meant something devastating had happened. Another 10 minutes passed. The doctors never returned. Flight attendants whispered urgently among themselves, their movements sharper, less rehearsed. Fear spread through the cabin in silence, a kind of silence that screamed louder than words. Then Mason stood. He stepped into the aisle, his voice low but commanding as he flagged down a flight attendant. What's happening? Her lips pressed tightly, hesitation written across her face. Finally, she whispered, just loud enough for him to hear, "The captain. He's unconscious." And now the first officer, he's not responding either. Mason's eyes widened slightly, though his face remained carved from stone. You're telling me nobody is flying this plane? The attendant swallowed, nodded once, and rushed away. The SEAL captain turned slowly, scanning the cabin. He could feel the weight of the revelation pressing down. Hundreds of lives, thousands of feet above the Atlantic, with no one at the controls. The air changed. Passengers sensed the shift even if they didn't know the details. A nervous energy coursed through the rows, whispered questions turning into audible fear. Emily's chest tightened. Her mind screamed at her to stay silent, to remain just another anonymous passenger. Yet the part of her she tried to bury, the pilot, the leader, was stirring. The intercom buzzed again. The young attendant's voice quivered. Is there anyone on board with flight experience? Anyone who can assist in the cockpit, please come forward. The words shattered whatever illusion of calm remained. A man near the front leapt up, only to admit he had flown small recreational planes decades ago. Another sheepishly admitted to some simulator hours. Murmurs turned into arguments, disbelief colliding with terror. The realization spread quickly. The aircraft, this massive, complex machine, was essentially a ghost ship. It was then that Mason moved to the center aisle. His presence alone was commanding, his voice cutting through the panic with the force of authority forged on battlefields. Listen up, he barked. Every head turned toward him. Even crying children fell briefly silent. Mason's voice carried the weight of someone who expected obedience. This is life or death. Who can fly this aircraft? The words froze the cabin. For a long, suffocating moment, silence reigned. Eyes darted around the room, desperate, searching for anyone to stand. But no one did. 100 strangers sat frozen, each silently begging for a miracle. Emily's hands tightened around the armrest of 21C. Her breath quickened, chest rising and falling in shallow bursts. She could feel Mason's words burrowing into her, pulling at the secret she had carried for years. She tried to look away, tried to bury the memory of cockpits, checklists, the roar of engines under her control. But the truth wouldn't stay buried. The silence stretched. Mason's eyes swept the cabin, hard, unyielding. "Somebody here knows how to fly," he growled. "If you do, this is the time to speak." Emily's throat tightened. Her heart pounded against her ribs, each beat screaming louder than her thoughts. She wanted to stay hidden, to let someone else rise. But no one did. No one else could. The SEAL's voice thundered again, urgent now, desperate yet unbroken. "Who can fly this aircraft?" Emily's hand twitched. She froze, caught between fear and inevitability. Then, slowly, almost unwillingly, she began to raise it. The cabin shifted, 100 eyes snapping toward her. For the first time in years, Emily Warren could no longer be invisible. The silence after Mason's words was almost unbearable. The steady hum of the engines seemed louder than ever, filling the cabin with a sound that reminded every passenger of the terrible truth. The plane was flying, but no one was flying it. Emily's hand hovered, trembling in indecision, but she lowered it quickly, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wasn't ready. Not yet. She couldn't. "Who can fly this aircraft?" Mason repeated, his voice booming through the aisle, steady but edged with urgency. He had commanded squads under fire, rallied men in chaos, but never had he faced a crowd like this. 100 strangers clinging to hope, each one silently begging for a savior to stand. A murmur rose. Passengers turned to each other, desperate. Some clutched their phones as if answers might appear on the glowing screens. Others prayed aloud, whispering hurried words in English, Spanish, Arabic, and more languages, merging into a single plea. From the front, a man stood suddenly, raising his hand. He was thin, middle-aged, with glasses slipping down his nose. His voice cracked with nervousness. I've flown before," he said. All heads swiveled toward him, hope flaring briefly. "How much?" Mason asked sharply. The man swallowed. Cessna 172, small planes. Years ago, in college. Nothing this size. A ripple of despair spread. The 777 was a beast compared to a single-engine trainer. Mason's jaw tightened. "Sit down," he said firmly. "We need someone who can do more than turn the ignition on a toy." The man sat quickly, shame coloring his face as passengers muttered, some angry, others fearful. Another hand went up in the middle rows. A young man with tousled hair and restless energy pushed to his feet. "I play flight simulators," he blurted. "All the time. I know the controls pretty well." Gasps, then angry outbursts. "Are you joking?" Someone shouted. "This isn't a game." Mason's eyes hardened. "Sit down before you kill us all," he snapped. The young man shrank back into his seat, his face flushed crimson. The cabin unraveled further. Voices rose, some panicked, some angry. "We're doomed," a woman cried from the rear, clutching her child. "We're going to crash." Others argued, demanding answers from flight attendants who could only repeat the truth. Both pilots were unconscious, and no one was in control of the plane. Emily's pulse thudded in her ears. Every word carved deeper into her conscience. She had wanted invisibility, But invisibility no longer existed. The cabin was a storm, passengers spinning in fear, Mason the only anchor trying to hold them together. "Listen to me," Mason roared again, stepping forward. His voice was iron. "Panic won't save you. We need a pilot. Right now." The weight of his words pressed down. Eyes darted, searching the crowd as if a savior might materialize. But no one moved. No one answered. Emily's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. She pressed her palms against her knees, nails digging through fabric. Her secret pressed against her like a stone in her lungs. She could hear echoes from years ago, voices of co-pilots, air traffic controllers, her own confident commands in the cockpit. She had buried that life. She had sworn never to return. But now, 273 lives hung in the balance. The teenager beside her glanced up, his eyes wide with fear. "We're gonna die, aren't we?" he whispered. His words pierced Emily like a blade. No, she couldn't let that happen. Slowly, painfully, she lifted her hand. At first, no one noticed. But Mason's eyes, sharp as a hawk's, caught the movement. He locked onto her, narrowing his gaze. "You," he barked, pointing straight at her. "What about you?" Emily's throat felt dry as sand. The cabin turned toward her, 100 pairs of eyes suddenly burning into her. She forced herself to speak, her voice trembling. I used to fly," she said softly. The murmurs erupted instantly. Hope, disbelief, skepticism. "Used to? What does that mean? Is she serious?" Mason cut through the noise, his focus unyielding. "What did you fly?" Emily hesitated. Every part of her screamed to sit back down, to disappear again. But she couldn't. She raised her chin, forcing the words out. "Commercial jets," she said. "This size." The cabin gasped. Heads whipped toward her with renewed energy, shock and relief mixing like fire and fuel. A child clapped without understanding, and his mother shushed him, tears streaming down her cheeks. But Mason didn't clap. He studied her with the cold, calculating gaze of a soldier evaluating a weapon. "When?" he demanded. Her breath caught. 10 years ago, she admitted, her voice cracking. The murmurs shifted again. Relief turned back into doubt. 10 years was an eternity in aviation. Technology had advanced. Procedures had changed. Could she really bridge a decade gap? "You sure about this?" Mason pressed. Emily swallowed hard. "No," she whispered truthfully. "But I'm the best chance you've got." For a moment, silence reigned. Then Mason nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Good enough." He turned toward the front, his booming voice addressing the stunned cabin. "We have a pilot." Gasps and cries followed, some hopeful, some skeptical. But the tide had shifted. Where panic had reigned, now there was a fragile thread of belief. Anchored to the quiet woman in 21C, Emily's legs trembled as she stood, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her chest. The aisle stretched before her like a runway, passengers leaning away, watching as she passed. Some whispered prayers, others stared with wide-eyed desperation. She avoided their gazes, forcing her eyes forward. Mason stepped beside her, a steady shadow at her back. "We'll do this together," he muttered, low enough only she could hear. Emily gave a small, shaky nod. She didn't trust her voice to respond. As they approached the cockpit, the reinforced door loomed like a wall between past and present. Her hand brushed the metal, and memories surged years of flying, the thrill of command, the tragedy that had driven her away. She closed her eyes briefly, pushing the ghosts back. Then she straightened, inhaled deeply, and stepped through the threshold. Behind her, the cabin held its breath. Ahead of her, The fate of 273 souls awaited. The moment Emily stood, the cabin changed. It wasn't just that she had revealed herself, it was the weight of what her words carried. For the last 2 hours, passengers had been spiraling in fear, grasping for anyone who might save them. Now, all that fragile, desperate hope condensed into a single figure, the quiet woman who had sat unnoticed in seat 21C. Every step she took down the aisle drew whispers. "That's her. She said she's a pilot. Can she really do it?" Some voices brimmed with relief, others dripped with doubt. A few reached out as she passed, fingertips brushing her sleeve as if touching her might anchor their own survival. Emily kept her eyes forward. If she met their gazes, she feared she would freeze, swallowed by the enormity of their trust. Mason walked just behind her, a solid presence, his broad frame clearing the way. His hand occasionally brushed her shoulder, not pushing, not pulling, just steadying her like ballast in a storm. "One step at a time," he muttered under his breath. "Don't think about the crowd. Just think about the controls." But Emily was thinking about more than the controls. She was thinking about the years she had locked this part of herself away, about the last time she had flown a commercial aircraft, about the tragedy that had ended everything. She had sworn she would never sit in a cockpit again. And now, fate was dragging her back. The cockpit door loomed ahead, sealed tight, guarded by 2 attendants. One of them, a young woman with blonde hair, pulled into a neat bun, looked at Emily with wide, desperate eyes. "You're the pilot?" she asked, her voice shaking. Emily almost corrected her. "Former." The word burned at the back of her throat, but she swallowed it down. Now was not the time for disclaimers. "Yes," Emily said instead, her voice steadier than she felt. The attendant nodded frantically, tapping in the security code. The heavy door clicked, then swung open. The air inside was different, stale, tinged with the acrid scent of oxygen masks. The blinking lights of the control panels bathed the cramped space in a harsh, unnatural glow. Emily froze in the doorway. The captain slumped against his seat, his face pale, his chest rising only faintly under the masks strapped across it. The first officer lay half-collapsed over the console, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. Monitors beeped faintly, alarms blinking warnings in red. The aircraft was on autopilot, holding altitude, but without human hands at the ready. It was flying blind into uncertainty. The sight hit Emily like a wave. For a moment, she wasn't standing in the present, but in the past, years ago, in another cockpit, in another crisis. The screams of warning alarms, the desperate commands, the sound of metal groaning before impact. She had lived this before, and barely survived. Her knees wavered. She gripped the doorframe, fighting to steady herself. "You all right?" Mason asked quietly, his voice close, his hand hovering near her back. Emily forced herself to inhale, to ground herself in the present. The past was gone. This was now. Hundreds of lives depended on her, not the ghosts she carried. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice cracked slightly. She stepped inside. The seat, her old seat, the left captain's chair, waited. She lowered herself into it, the familiar creak of the leather, both comforting and suffocating. Her fingers brushed the yoke, trembling as muscle memory surged back. It felt like touching the hand of a long-lost lover, familiar, intimate, and painful. Mason leaned against the bulkhead, his eyes never leaving her. "What do you need?" he asked simply. Emily's training snapped into place, rusty but alive. "Checklists, communications, someone on the radio," she said quickly. "I need control of the aircraft." The attendant scrambled, following her instructions. One pulled the unconscious pilots gently aside, clearing space. Another handed Emily the headset. The sound of static filled her ears, punctuated by the faint, distant voices of air traffic controllers. Her hands moved automatically, running over switches and dials. Her heart raced, her breath shallow, but the rhythm of flying began to return. She had done this thousands of times. Once it had been second nature. Could it be again? "Mayday, mayday, mayday," she said into the mic, her voice unsteady but clear. "This is Flight 482. Both flight crew are incapacitated. I am assuming control of the aircraft." The radio crackled. A calm voice responded, professional, but edged with alarm. "Flight 482. Say again? Did you say both pilots are incapacitated?" "Yes," Emily said firmly, forcing steel into her voice. "This is a former airline captain. I have limited recent experience, but I am taking command." The controller paused, then replied with deliberate calm. "Copy that. Flight 482. We are alerting emergency services. Stay on course. Maintain current altitude. We'll guide you step by step." Emily exhaled, the sound shaky but steady. For the first time since standing, she felt a sliver of control. Behind her, Mason shifted, his voice low. "You sound like you've done this a million times." "I have," she whispered back. "But not in 10 years. He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Doesn't matter. You're here now. And we're with you." Emily didn't reply. She couldn't. Her throat tightened with the weight of it all. The fear of failing. The terror of reliving the past. But beneath it was something else. The faint ember of who she used to be. The woman who had once commanded skies. The woman who had once been proud to wear the uniform. Her fingers steadied on the controls. She adjusted the autopilot, scanned the instruments, recalibrated her mind to the rhythm of the machine. The storm outside rattled the fuselage, turbulence rolling through like waves. The passengers behind the door murmured, cried, prayed, but in here, the world narrowed to dials, switches, and the steady hum of engines. Emily leaned forward, pressing the push-to-talk switch again. "Flight 482 to control. I'm going to need vectors for approach. And patience." "Copy that? Flight 482, the voice responded. "We'll get you down." Mason's hand landed gently on the back of her seat. Not pressing, not commanding, just there. "You've got this," he said simply. Emily didn't answer. She couldn't. Instead, she tightened her grip on the yoke, stared into the dark horizon ahead, and whispered silently to herself, "Not again. Not this time. This time, I bring them home." The door sealed behind them with a heavy, metallic click, cutting off the muffled noise of panicked passengers. For a moment, Emily felt the silence press in on her like the cabin itself had shrunk. The cockpit, once her sanctuary, now felt claustrophobic, like the walls were conspiring to remind her she didn't belong here anymore. The flight deck was chaos. Warning chimes pulsed at irregular intervals. Red lights blinked across the panels, and the dead weight of the two incapacitated pilots lingered in the seats. Oxygen masks still dangled from their faces, but neither man was stirring. Flight attendants hovered awkwardly near the doorway, glancing between Emily and Mason, uncertain whether they should remain or retreat. Emily forced her voice steady. "Help me move them." Her tone carried authority, the same clipped command she had once used with her own first officers. The attendants jumped to action. Together, they shifted the unconscious captain and co-pilot, buckling them gently into the jump seats behind. Mason handled most of the heavy lifting, his muscles straining as he pulled one man clear of the console. Emily noticed how careful he was, despite his size. For all his commanding presence, Mason treated the injured with almost tender precision. When the chairs were clear, Emily lowered herself into the captain's seat. The feel of it was both familiar and alien. Her body remembered the contours, the armrests, the headrest, the way the seat harness crossed her chest, but her mind recoiled, dragging up memories she had long since buried. The smell of scorched wires, the blaring of alarms, the helplessness as a plane went down years ago. The night she quit flying for good. Emily's breath caught, and for a split second she froze. But then Mason's voice grounded her again. "You're not alone. Take it one thing at a time." She nodded faintly, gripping the yoke. Her hands trembled, but beneath the tremor was a flicker of muscle memory knowledge stored in her bones, waiting to be awakened. She reached for the autopilot panel, scanning displays, recalibrating her thoughts. "We're stable at 35,000 feet, she murmured. Half to herself, half to Mason. Autopilot's holding altitude, but we'll need to assess fuel, weather, and systems if we're going to make it to an approach." One of the attendants, her nametag reads Sarah, swallowed nervously. Do you know what you're doing?" Emily didn't look up. "Enough to get us home. But I'll need cooperation. No distractions." Sarah nodded quickly, retreating a step. Mason settled behind Emily's chair, his large hands resting casually on the headrest. He wasn't hovering, wasn't commanding. Just there, steady, like an anchor in the storm. Emily slipped the headset over her ears. The hum of static filled the silence, followed by the clipped voice of air traffic control. "Flight 482, confirm your situation." She pressed the switch. Her voice came out calmer than she expected. "This is Flight 482. Both flight crew incapacitated. I am a former airline captain. I have assumed control of the aircraft." A pause. Then the calm, professional tone again. "Copy that. 482. We are diverting traffic and preparing emergency protocols." "Say your name, Captain." Emily hesitated, her throat tightening. She hadn't been called that in a decade. "Emily Warren," she said finally. "Roger that, Captain Warren. We'll stay with you. What is your current fuel reading?" Emily scanned the gauges. "We've got enough for London, but not much wiggle room." "Understood. Weather is deteriorating over the Atlantic corridor. We're evaluating alternate approaches. Stay with autopilot for now. We'll get you vectors." She acknowledged and slumped slightly, pulling the headset down around her neck. The weight of the word captain echoed in her chest. She wasn't that person anymore, was she? And yet, here she was, sitting in the chair, responsible for every soul on board. Mason leaned close, his voice low. "They trust you. Whether you believe it or not, you're already their captain." Emily glanced back at him. His eyes were steady, unwavering. He wasn't offering empty encouragement. He was stating a fact. And somehow that helped. Meanwhile, in the cabin, passengers were abuzz with nervous speculation. Word had spread that a woman from seat 21C was now flying the aircraft. Some clung to the hope like lifelines, whispering prayers of gratitude. Others shook their heads in disbelief. A passenger? That's insane. What if she crashes us? But Mason's commanding outburst still rang in their ears. Who can fly this aircraft? And Emily had been the only one to stand. That act alone earned her a fragile credibility. In seat 12A, a businessman clenched his armrests so tightly his knuckles whitened. "This is madness," he muttered to his neighbor. But even he fell silent when the engines hummed steadily, the plane slicing smoothly through turbulence under Emily's hands. Back in the cockpit, Emily began running mental checklists. Her voice grew more confident as she narrated. "Auto throttle steady. Fuel tank 1 and 2 are balanced. Navigation's locked in. We're still on track for London." Mason listened, his brow furrowing. "You sound like you're already back in your element." Emily almost smiled, though it was thin and bitter. Elements have a way of testing you when you least want them to. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Mason asked softly, "What happened, Emily? Why'd you stop flying?" Her hands froze on the yoke. The question was gentle, but it pierced like a blade. Images flooded her mind. The fire, the wreckage, the headlines that had branded her career in ash. She inhaled sharply, shaking her head. "Not now." "I can't." Mason didn't press. He simply nodded, folding his arms. "Fair. But remember, you're not that person anymore. You're here now. And you're saving lives." Emily tightened her grip on the controls, grounding herself in the present. The past would wait. Minutes ticked by, each one a fragile eternity. The radio crackled again. "Flight 482. Be advised weather at Heathrow is deteriorating. We're assessing alternate landing fields. Do you feel capable of manual approach?" Emily's heart jolted. Manual approach. In storm conditions? After 10 years away from the skies. She swallowed, then pressed the switch. "I'll do whatever it takes." "Roger, Captain Warren. We'll guide you step by step. Stay calm. Maintain heading." As the transmission ended, Mason leaned down, close enough that she felt the steadiness in his breath. "Whatever it takes," he echoed. Emily stared at the horizon ahead. The Atlantic stretched endlessly, dark and shifting under storm clouds. She felt the weight of 273 souls pressing on her shoulders, but also something else, the faint spark of who she once was. The captain of the sky. And for the first time in 10 years, Emily allowed herself to believe she might be that person again. She sat taller in her seat, adjusted the controls, and whispered under her breath, steady and firm, "Let's bring them home." The first shudder came like a warning. A low rumble rolled through the fuselage, followed by a sharp lurch that rattled every loose item in the cabin. Coffee cups spilled, luggage shifted in the overhead bins, and a ripple of panicked gasps rose from the passengers. Emily's hands tightened on the yoke instinctively, her body bracing against the movement. For years, she had flown through turbulence like this, adjusting without thought. But after a decade away, her instincts warred with hesitation. The storm had found them. She scanned the instruments. Winds at 40,000 feet. Cross-currents pushing them off course. Lightning flickering on the horizon, like veins of fire across the dark Atlantic sky. Her headset crackled. "Flight 482. We're tracking weather cells across your route. You may encounter severe turbulence. Advise if able to divert south." Emily exhaled sharply. "Negative. Control. Fuel reserves are limited. We'll push through." Her voice sounded steady, but inside, her pulse raced. This was exactly the kind of trial she feared, machines under strain, chaos in the skies. She had promised herself never to feel it again, and now here she was, strapped to hundreds of tons of metal, responsible for hundreds of lives. Another violent lurch rattled the plane. A child screamed somewhere in the back. Oxygen masks swayed above passengers' heads like pendulums. Mason's voice came low, steady, behind her. "You've got this. Talk me through it." Emily's jaw tightened. She had always trained co-pilots by narrating her thought process aloud. Now Mason had slipped into that role, steady, calm, a wall of strength she could lean on. "All right," she said, her voice clipped but deliberate. "We ride it out. Autopilot can't handle turbulence this severe, it overcorrects." Switching to manual. She flipped the switch, and the aircraft shuddered as control shifted back to her. Her muscles screamed in protest. It took strength to keep the yoke steady against the storm's push and pull. Every movement mattered. Too sharp, and they'd banked dangerously. Too soft, and the plane would roll uncontrolled. Her arms trembled, sweat slicking her palms. For a terrifying second, she imagined her grip slipping, the machine veering. She squeezed tighter, whispering to herself, "Focus, feel it. You know this." The storm roared outside, rain pelting against the fuselage like bullets. Lightning flared again, illuminating the cockpit in brief, eerie flashes. In those split seconds of brightness, Emily caught glimpses of Mason's face, calm, unwavering, and of her own reflection in the dark glass of the instrument panel. The woman staring back looked nothing like the frightened, quiet figure in seat 21C. This woman's eyes burned with determination. But inside, the ghosts were clawing at her. She couldn't ignore them. The turbulence, the alarms, the chaos. It was all too familiar. Her mind betrayed her, dragging her back to that night. A memory hit her in fragments. A routine flight out of Denver. A sudden mechanical failure. Fire alarms blaring. Her co-pilot shouting coordinates. Passengers screaming behind the reinforced door. The final moments of descent, powerless to stop the crash. Dozens injured, her career shredded. The blame, unfair but heavy, had fallen squarely on her shoulders. She had walked away from aviation that night and never returned. Until now. Her breath caught, her vision blurring. Her grip faltered. Emily. Mason's voice cut through the storm, sharp but grounding. His hand pressed against her shoulder, firm. "Stay here. With me. Don't go back." She blinked, breath ragged. For a heartbeat, she wanted to argue, to say she couldn't. But Mason's eyes met hers in the reflection, steady and unyielding. She inhaled deeply, forcing air into her lungs. The past wasn't real. Not now. This was real, the storm, the plane, the lives. And she wasn't powerless this time. She had control. Her grip steadied on the yoke. Her breathing slowed. "That's it," Mason murmured. "You're flying us through." Eyes forward. Emily nodded faintly, her focus sharpening. She adjusted pitch, banking slightly to ease into the current. The turbulence roared, tossing them like a toy, but she rode the motion instead of fighting its gentle corrections. A dance with the storm. Minutes stretched like hours. The storm battered them, lightning flashing, passengers crying, but the plane held steady under her command. "Control, this is Flight 482, she said into the headset, voice firm again. "We're experiencing severe turbulence, but I am maintaining manual control." "Copy that, 482, the controller replied, their tone betraying relief. "You're doing fine. Just a little farther east, then you'll break through." Emily clung to those words like a lifeline. Just a little farther. Behind her, Mason shifted, speaking softly. "You know, when I was deployed, storms like this used to terrify the younger guys. They'd freeze, lock up. The trick wasn't ignoring fear, it was flying through it. Fear just means you care about surviving." Emily almost smiled, despite the storm. "I care a lot right now." "Good," Mason said simply. "So does everyone back there." The turbulence peaked again, slamming them with a force that made the entire fuselage groan. A luggage bin burst open, bags tumbling into the aisle. Somewhere, glass shattered. Screams echoed, muffled through the cockpit door. Emily's arms ached, but she held steady. Her knuckles whitened, sweat beading along her hairline. She whispered again, a mantra now, "Not again. Not this time." And then, like a curtain lifting, the storm began to thin. The thunder softened. The lightning faded into the distance. The shuddering eased, and the nose of the plane leveled smoothly against calmer winds. The silence was almost deafening after so much chaos. Emily sagged back against the seat, muscles trembling, every breath ragged. For a moment, she let herself close her eyes. She had done it. She had flown through. Mason broke the silence first. Told you. You've still got it. She laughed weakly, a sound half relief, half disbelief. Barely. Barely still counts, Mason said with a grin. The headset crackled again. Flight 482. You're clear of the storm. You did well, Captain Warren. Prepare for descent vectors into London. Emergency crews are standing by. The word captain struck her again, but this time it didn't choke her. This time it fit, if only slightly. She straightened in her chair, adjusting the autopilot again to give her muscles a reprieve. The hum of steady engines filled the cockpit. Behind her, passengers slowly quieted as the storm passed. For the first time since standing up in seat 21C, Emily allowed herself a small, steady thought. We might actually make it. But she knew the hardest part was still ahead. Storm or no storm, she would have to land this aircraft. And landing wasn't about survival. It was about precision, judgment, and nerve. She glanced at Mason. That was the fight. The next part is the war. He raised a brow. The landing? Emily nodded. Anyone can fly through a storm if they're stubborn enough. But bringing this bird down safely? That's what makes a pilot. Her voice was steady, almost calm now. But inside, she knew the true test hadn't even begun. The storm was behind them, but the sky ahead looked no less menacing. Dark clouds rolled over London like an advancing army, swallowing the city below in sheets of rain. Emily stared through the cockpit window, her jaw tight, her breath shallow. This was it. The moment she had feared since she first raised her hand in seat 21C. Flying was one thing. Landing was everything. Her headset crackled. Flight 482, you are cleared for priority landing at Heathrow. Be advised winds, gusting at 25 knots, visibility 2 miles. Emergency vehicles are on standby. Emily closed her eyes for half a second, grounding herself. 2 miles of visibility. Strong crosswinds. Emergency crews already waiting, expecting disaster. She whispered under her breath, not this time. Not again. She straightened in her seat. Control, this is Flight 482. Copy clearance. Preparing for manual approach. Roger that, 482. We'll guide you in. Call when ready to descend. Emily flicked the autopilot off. The yoke stiffened in her hands, the full weight of the aircraft returning to her control. Her muscles screamed in protest, still aching from the battle with the storm, but she held firm. Mason leaned close behind her. Talk me through it. Same as before. One thing at a time. Her voice came clipped, precise. Flaps set for initial descent. Speed brake armed. Gear down at 2,500 feet. Manual throttle watch the wind shear. Mason nodded. He didn't understand every word, but his presence anchored her. The plane began its descent, dropping through the thick, gray cloud cover. Instantly, the fuselage shuddered, buffeted by crosswinds. Passengers gasped, some crying, some whispering frantic prayers. The cabin was a sea of white knuckles and pale faces. Easy, Emily muttered to the machine, as if coaxing a frightened animal. Stay with me? Lightning flashed again, briefly illuminating the runway lights far in the distance. They flickered like faint stars through the rain, impossibly small targets for such a massive machine. Her breath caught. Can I really do this? The ghost stirred again. The crash years ago, the fire, the screaming headlines branding her a failure. Her hands trembled. She could feel the weight of that night pressing on her chest. And then Mason's voice cut through the fog of doubt, calm and steady. Emily, look at me. She glanced sideways. His eyes were firm, unyielding. That was then. This is now. You're not that pilot, You're this pilot. You're bringing us home. Her grip steadied. She nodded once. Right, let's do it. At 3,000 feet, the runway lights grew clearer, glowing through the mist. The plane rocked violently in the crosswind. An alarm screamed in protest. Wind shear. Wind shear. The warning system blared. Emily's jaw tightened. Ignore it. Adjust pitch. She gripped the yoke, fighting the invisible fists of air, hammering the fuselage. Mason braced himself, gripping the seat back. Feels like the storm's trying to rip us apart. It is, Emily said flatly. But it won't. At 2,000 feet, the rain intensified, slamming against the windshield in torrents. Wipers screeched furiously, barely clearing the sheets of water. The runway blurred, vanishing and reappearing like a mirage. Passengers cried out again as the plane jolted downward. A man yelled, "We're going to crash." His voice carried down the aisle like poison, fueling panic. But in the cockpit, Emily's voice cut clean through. Stabilize. Nose down, wings level. Come on, girl. She wasn't talking to Mason now. She was talking to the plane. To herself. To fate. The engines roared as she adjusted throttle, compensating against the brutal gusts. The altimeter ticked down. 1,500 feet. 1,000 feet. Control, this is Flight 482, she said into the mic, her voice strong, unshaking now. On final approach. Manual landing. Roger, 482, came the reply. Runway is clear. Emergency teams in position. Good luck, Captain. The last 1,000 feet stretched like eternity. Emily's entire body tensed as she fought the yoke, the plane rocking side to side. Mason's voice steadied her, soft but commanding. You're lined up. Keep it steady. You've got this. 500 feet, Emily muttered. The ground rushed toward them, runway lights glowing like salvation. 400. The plane bucked left. She corrected sharply, rain blurring her vision. 300. A gust slammed into the right wing. The stall alarm blared. Stay with me, she hissed, yanking the yoke left. 200. The runway was directly ahead now, but the crosswind shoved them sideways. Mason's hand gripped the chair so hard his knuckles whitened. Hold her steady. 100 feet. The nose dipped dangerously low. Emily pulled back with every ounce of strength, her arms screaming, sweat dripping down her temples. Come on, she whispered. Come on, come on. 50 feet. The wheels aligned almost. Another gust hit, pushing the plane off centerline. Alarms screamed, passengers shrieked. Emily roared, a sound torn from the depths of her soul. She slammed the throttle, flared the nose, and wrestled the yoke into alignment. The wheels slammed against the runway with bone-rattling force. The aircraft bounced, screeched, then slammed down again, sparks spitting from the landing gear. For a split-second, silence. Then the roar of reverse thrusters shook the plane as Emily hauled back on the levers, braking against wet asphalt. The fuselage shuddered, the engines howled, the runway blurred past. And then, finally mercifully, the plane slowed, 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 until it stopped. For a heartbeat, the cockpit was silent, except for the rain hammering the windshield. Emily sat frozen, her hands locked on the yoke, her chest heaving with ragged breaths. Mason broke the silence first. His voice was low, reverent. You did it. Emily exhaled shakily, her grip loosening. She leaned back against the seat, trembling. We're down. The intercom crackled to life as a flight attendant's voice choked with tears. Ladies and gentlemen, we're on the ground. We are safe. The cabin erupted in cheers, sobs, and applause. Strangers hugged, families wept into each other's shoulders. Even the cynical businessman in 1-2A buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with relief. In the cockpit, Mason placed a hand gently on Emily's shoulder. "You brought them home." Emily swallowed hard, her vision blurring with tears she had held back for too long. She whispered, almost to herself, "This time, I finished the flight." Outside, emergency crews swung the plane, lights flashing through sheets of rain. But inside, 273 people owed their lives to the quiet woman from seat 21C, the woman who had sworn never to fly again, until she had no choice but to become their captain. And for the first time in a decade, Emily Warren felt something she thought she'd lost forever. Not just survival, not just relief, but redemption. The engines wound down slowly, their thunder fading into a low, exhausted hum. The rain still pelted the fuselage, drumming against the metal skin of the aircraft, but inside the cockpit, an almost sacred quiet lingered. Emily sat frozen in the captain's chair, her hands still locked on the yoke. Her muscles screamed from the effort, her chest heaved with ragged breaths, but her mind refused to release the controls. For 10 endless minutes, her body had been nothing but tension and fire, and now she didn't know how to let go. Mason leaned closer, his voice steady, gentle. "It's over. You can breathe now." Her fingers trembled as she finally loosened her grip. She let her hands fall into her lap and leaned back against the seat. For a moment, she closed her eyes, listening to the sound of her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. "It's over," she told herself. And yet the words felt unreal. She had braced herself for failure, for another tragedy, for history to repeat itself. But somehow, against storms, machines, and her own ghosts, she had done it. The intercom buzzed. Sarah, the attendant, her voice thick with emotion, announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have landed safely. Please remain seated while emergency crews assist." Her words were swallowed instantly by cheers, sobs, and applause erupting from the cabin. The sound carried faintly through the cockpit door raw, unfiltered gratitude from hundreds of people who had stared death in the face and survived. Emily's eyes burned. Tears gathered, hot and relentless, slipping past her lashes before she could stop them. She hadn't cried in years, hadn't allowed herself to feel the weight of her failure, let alone her redemption. And now, in this cramped cockpit, with rain pouring outside and applause echoing inside, the dam finally broke. Mason didn't speak. He simply rested a hand on her shoulder, solid and reassuring. He understood sometimes silence said more than words ever could. When the cockpit door opened, the first wave of crew and passengers looked at Emily like she was something other than human. Not just a pilot, not just a woman, but a miracle. A mother carrying a toddler pressed her forehead against the frame, sobbing. "You saved my baby," she whispered. A businessman in a wrinkled suit, the same one who had doubted her in seat 12A, pushed forward, his face pale. For a moment, he just stared at her, guilt etched in his features. Then he said quietly, "I was wrong." He extended a trembling hand. Emily hesitated, then clasped it. His grip was firm, desperate. One by one, more came. Some wept, some whispered thank yous, some just touched her sleeve in silent reverence. Emily sat through it all, overwhelmed, unsure if she deserved any of it. Do they know? She wondered. Do they know I walked away once? That I swore never to do this again? But the truth was simple. She had brought them home. Whatever ghosts haunted her, whatever mistakes she had made in the past tonight, she had redeemed herself. Outside, emergency lights strobed against the storm as fire trucks and ambulances surrounded the aircraft. Medics boarded quickly, rushing past to tend to the unconscious captain and first officer. They would survive, Emily learned. though their recovery would take time. Sarah, still shaken but composed, returned to the cockpit, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Emily," she said softly, "the authorities want to speak with you. But before that, the passengers. They keep asking your name. They want to know who saved them." Emily hesitated. Her instinct was to shrink, to retreat into anonymity. But Mason's hand on her shoulder steadied her. "You should tell them," he said. "Own it. You earned it." Emily rose slowly, her legs weak, her body drained. When she stepped into the cabin, every eye turned toward her. The sound of applause swelled again, filling the fuselage like thunder. For a moment, she froze under the weight of their stares. She wasn't used to this, the spotlight, the adoration. She had been invisible for so long, content to disappear in seat 21C. But now, hundreds of faces tear-streaked, hopeful, alive looked at her, like she was their anchor, their savior. She cleared her throat, her voice soft at first. "My name is Emily Warren." The crowd quieted, hanging on her words. I used to be a pilot. I walked away from it a long time ago. I thought I'd never fly again. But tonight, fate had other plans." She paused, her throat tight. "I didn't do this alone. You all trusted me. The crew stood strong. And," she glanced back at Mason, "some of us reminded me to believe in myself again. So thank you for surviving with me." The applause roared again, louder than before. Strangers wept openly, hugging, clapping, reaching for her hands. For once, Emily let herself stand in the light. Hours later, after statements to officials, after paramedics had ensured the passengers were safe, Emily finally stepped off the plane. The rain had slowed to a mist, the runway glistening under the floodlights. Emergency crews bustled, but the world outside felt strangely still, as if holding its breath. Mason walked beside her, his uniform damp, his presence as steady as it had been since the moment he shouted in the cabin. "You did more than fly that plane," he said quietly. "You found yourself again." Emily tilted her head toward him, weary but smiling faintly. "I'm not sure who I found, but whoever she is, I think I like her." He chuckled, then grew serious. "You're a hero, Emily." She shook her head. "I'm just someone who finally stopped running." They stood for a moment in the mist, watching emergency crews finish their work. Behind them, the plane loomed silent now, but forever marked by what had happened in its cabin. Emily inhaled deeply, the cool air filling her lungs. For the first time in a decade, it didn't feel heavy. It felt like freedom. Later, when the passengers dispersed, some to hospitals, some to hotels, many came back to thank her again. A child handed her a small drawing he had made on the flight stick figures holding hands, a plane with smiling faces inside. He had written in shaky letters, "Thank you for saving us." Emily pressed the paper to her chest, her throat tightening again. In that moment, she knew something with absolute clarity. This wasn't just survival. It was redemption. It was a second chance. And maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something new. Long after the crowds had gone, when the runway lights dimmed and the plane stood quiet, Emily walked one last time through the empty cabin. She paused at seat 21C, resting her hand on the headrest. That was where she had been invisible. That was where her story had almost ended. She smiled softly, whispering to the empty seat, "Thank you." Then she turned, walked down the aisle, and stepped back into the world, not as the quiet woman in 21C, but as Emily Warren, the captain who brought them home.